Do we start, do you think? No little bubble. Oh. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our second Transition Network Resilience.org webinar. You're all very welcome, and one of the things that's great with this technology is that you can leave thoughts and messages and questions down the side of the window here. So it'd be really great, just while we're doing an introductory round and introducing who our panel is, if you could just say where you're attending from. It'd be really interesting to get a sense of who's joining us on this webinar. And there will be time in the second half of this webinar to take your questions, so you can write those in as we go along, as we go through. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel for today's webinar. This discussion, my name is Rob Hopkins from Transition Network. We're also joined by Tony Greenham, who's Head of Finance and Business at New Economics Foundation. He has a special focus on reforming the financial sector and aligning the interests of society and business. He has a research interests in local and regional development and post-growth economics, and he's also a trustee of Transition Network. Nigel Jump is an expert professional economist with a successful career in applied development and market economics. He was chief economist for the Southwest Regional Development Agency here in the UK, and an international industrial markets and risk economist with Barclays and Swiss Volksbank, and he's a visiting professor in economics at the Universities of Bath and Plymouth. And Fiona Ward set up and ran the Transition Streets programme for TransitionTown.net and initiated and runs the Reconomy project for Transition Network. And she's the author of the local economic blueprint that we are gathered here today to discuss. And is supporting a similar process in Hereford and in Brixton. She has a background in business consulting, working for companies of all shapes and sizes over the last 20 years to define and deliver business transformation strategies. And we're also hoping, although technology is somewhat battling against us, that we will be joined shortly by Molly Scott-Cato, who is Professor of Strategy and Sustainability at Roehampton University, the author of the Bioregional Economy and the Economics Speaker for the Green Party, and a lead candidate in the Southwest for the 2014 European elections. So a distinguished panel, and thank you all to everybody for giving their time today to be part of this conversation. So I'd like to start by asking Fiona if she could introduce the economic blueprint. What was the thinking behind it? Where did it come from? And what she sees as being its promise and its limitations. So, Fiona.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, we started the process that led to the blueprint probably about 2 years ago. It was around the time we started the Reconomy project, which is a bit of the transition network that's looking at how transition towns or transition villages or cities can actually transform their local economic system to do this kind of grassroots-based, place-based economic development. And one of the questions that we had was, how can we show the actual potential of this kind of economy and not just have it dismissed as a few, hippies making a bit of jam on the side or retrofitting a few lofts or something like that, because we saw that there was actually enormous potential and a lot of opportunities in all sorts of sectors to produce new jobs and livelihoods, as well as give a lot of social benefits and environmental benefits as well. So we came up with this idea of actually doing the analysis that would show in quantitative terms, so in hard money terms, exactly how much it would be worth to a local town, for example, if they transformed their economic system. And we thought by doing that, that would show that there's some real credibility to this and there's some enormous opportunities, particularly in this time of austerity, which we're suffering just about everywhere. So the other thing that we wanted to do was to show that we could unite with other local organisations and do this work together, because it's always felt very important that Transition Town or initiative on its own couldn't and probably shouldn't go about transforming their economic system. You need to work with the local councils, with the chambers of trade, for example, with local colleges and schools, with development trusts and so on. So one of the things we wanted to do with this was experiment with putting together this group of stakeholders and then have these stakeholders collectively really hold this work and begin by defining what kind of local economy they want to see and what purpose they want to serve that might be different from the economy that we have at the moment. So we undertook this work in 3 different places. We are doing it in Totnes as a market town, and we're also doing it in Herefordshire as a rural county. So for those of you not in the UK, that's a much higher level of scale, which is more aligned to kind of our local government system probably. And then we also wanted to do it in an inner city area, a very urban area, and so we're working in Brixton in that environment as well, because we really wanted to see and experiment with these different levels of scale and see do similar processing in those places, or does it need to differ because we're working in a city as opposed to a rural area, for example. So most recently we finished the work in Totnes, which was the market town, and based on a long and quite exhaustive data analysis process, we've come up with a few numbers that show the potential. So for example, within food, if we relocalise our food sector here in Totnes, which is an area with about a population of about 10,000 households, then we know that £30 million a year is spent in our local food economy. Most of that goes out through one large supermarket, and most of it is not on local produce, even though here we actually have quite a strong local food system. So to cut a long analysis story short, we calculated that of that 30 million, probably £22 million is an opportunity. That's the amount that actually leaves our food economy at the moment, even though here we are in a very rural, very productive area. So for us, that's the size of the pie we can go after that. We also looked at the retrofitting sector. So if we retrofit all of our homes here in Totnes, these 10,000 domestic properties, we calculate that just to bring them up to a reasonable level of energy efficiency, that's worth something like £26 million to us. And if we go for a much fuller retrofit with things like solid wall insulation, for example, that's up to £75 million worth of value. So that's really significant in a small town like ours. That amount of potential is quite enormous. And then thirdly, we looked at renewable energy, and we explored our renewable energy assets, which around here is mostly around solar and wind and a little bit wind. And we calculated that that alone could generate £6 million worth of revenue for our community every year from renewable energy. And what we're doing here then is taking just 10% of that potential, which is about over £5 million, and seeing, well, let's go ahead and let's actually try and deliver that. Let's turn those opportunities into reality and see how that works, and can we actually do that? And we've got a plan in place, a 3-year plan that's going about doing that, and that's based on some existing work that's already been underway for quite a while, as well as some new projects, and that's all being done in partnership with our local stakeholders. So it feels really exciting. You know, it's still the start of an early process, but yeah, we're really looking forward to that happening and moving along with that. And in the other 2 areas, Brixton are still working on their reports. They're a little bit later starting than the rest of us, and we expect those to be out this summer. And Herefordshire, as a rural county, have finished doing the reports. Those are available as well, and we can give you the link at the end, or I assume where people can get the report from if they haven't already. And we're just about to have the stakeholders meeting this week. We've taken a slightly different approach there, where we've looked at doing the analysis first and coming up with the data, and then trying to use that to get the stakeholders' attention, because transition is quite so entrenched there. So without going into too much detail, it's been great to experiment in these different places because we're all going to see but that's it in a nutshell, the process.
Thank you, Fiona. So, Tony, your work is very much around looking at this issues of resilience and sustainability in terms of economics on the more national scale. What's your sense of what something like the blueprint that Fiona's outlined can play in that context? And what are your reflections having read the Totnes blueprint?
Yeah, there are several good ways in which it can contribute, not least the fact that it is a stakeholder participative process, and that brings in local knowledge and ideas into a planning process at a much lower scale than perhaps is often really considered. So I think just from that pure point of view of building a participative process, it's useful. In terms of what's happening with, what the outcomes might be economically, I think there are a couple of reflections to explore, perhaps, which we'll do during this webinar, and that is, what is the theory behind saying that this would be a better situation for everyone if everyone were to undergo a blueprint exercise and were to implement the sorts of projects that Fiona's talked about? How would we all be better off? You can see how one individual area that pursues it by relocalizing some degree of production would gain in terms of jobs and income and so on. But would we all be better off? I think this is a quite interesting question to explore. My view is that we would, but we have to have an account of how that would happen. And I think that this is, I would point to two themes which I think are really useful to think about. The first is efficiency. Economics is always terribly concerned with efficiency, of course, and it is the pursuit of cost efficiencies and scale that has led us to a highly globalized economy with supply chains that stretch around the planet. A vastly different economy from 30, 40 years ago in Totnes. But I would suggest that the pursuit of those efficiencies are in some sense illusory because the environmental and social costs and some of the economic efficiencies are in fact somewhat illusory because they rely on just simply changing the balance of power between powerful global corporations and small producers. So there is a question mark about how efficient the globalization of production and distribution has been. But there's a second consideration which is normally ignored by economics entirely, and you mentioned it, Rob, and it's resilience. And I think here we have to recognize that there are some benefits from not being as efficient as possible in the economic sense. There are benefits to diversity of provision of businesses, of much more provision at a local scale. And that's simply that it contributes to the resilience of the economy and therefore society to shocks, to changes in the provision of materials or economic shocks, financial shocks, and that we should be careful to think about the balance, what is the right balance between resilience and efficiency. So I think that the relocalization of certain types of production that this blueprint would lead you to might actually improve efficiency in some senses by factoring in the social and environmental impact of the economy. But secondly, it builds in greater resilience, and I think that that is something which is going to become increasingly important as we face a more uncertain environmental situation, as well as perhaps a more fragile financial economic situation too. So overall, I think this is a really tremendously positive process. There are, of course, questions about what is the right size to be doing this. Should you be doing it at the level of a Totnes market town? Should it be a city region? Should it be a larger region of a country? These are really good questions to explore. But I've probably talked enough now, so I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you, Tony. Nigel, you've had more of a background from your work with the Southwest Regional Development Agency looking at sort of more regional economic planning. I wonder what your reflections are on the blueprint.
I think the great thing about localization is very much the information it provides, and a lot of people are making decisions on a daily basis, and they're not necessarily as well informed about how to make those decisions as the theoretical textbooks would say in terms of economics. We assume most of the time that people in any market know what's going on and have access to all the information they need. So to me, the main benefit of this blueprint and these activities is that consumers, businesses, and others in the locality can really understand their supply chains and really understand how their activity and their spending relates to the local economy and where it could be better and where it could be worse. I think the main issue for me is the boundary issue, in that even at the Southwest level, which was the biggest region in England geographically, we had great problems with boundary issues about, oh, why should it be that something that's 2 miles over the border in just outside Wiltshire should not get something, and somebody a mile the other way should get something? Why is the border between Cornwall and Devon so important in terms of funding and investment and those kind of things? So the real issue for me is, if you're in Totnes and you're suddenly, the idea is you must buy from within Totnes, what happens to a business that happens to be just literally across the border? So the boundary issues are very hard. In terms of resilience, I agree with what Tony said. Globalization, I think, has brought many, many benefits in terms of economic activity, but it has overshot itself in some senses. And unbridled globalization is clearly doing some damage environmentally, and it does some damage in many other ways. But I do think unbridled localization will have similar effects. Most of the time, we find people who trade and people who exchange are better off than people who don't. And businesses that are aware of what's going on in neighboring areas and over boundaries, whether they're national boundaries or local boundaries, would tend to be able to compete better, would tend in the long run to be more productive, would tend to be able to pay higher wages, and so create more jobs. So you still have to have that basic problem of, if, for example, there was talk in the document about what is a reasonable standard of living, that somebody should determine what a reasonable standard of living is. Who's going to determine that? And who's going to say that all the people in Totnes will agree with whatever that definition of reasonable standard of living is? So the great thing about market economics is that you, by a process of individual decision making, you tend to get good outcomes, not always the best outcomes, but good outcomes. Where it goes wrong, where there's market failure or where there's government failure, you clearly need some sort of intervention. And the danger for localization is it goes too far the other way. It's always a spectrum in economics, and it'd be interesting to see exactly how, in practical terms, we can get over these principled arguments and say, in practical terms, how do we get that 10 million into Totnes? How do we make sure that that is more efficient or more resilient than the alternative as we have it at the moment? So those are the key questions and the key issues it raises for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Well, Molly has given up trying to be here in person due to technical things, but she's been putting some messages in here. So Molly's latest book, as I mentioned, is about bioregionalism, which was an idea that originated in the US in the late 70s, early 80s, which was about trying to redraw political and economic boundaries based around watersheds originally. So she says perhaps somebody could mention the idea of bioregions. The idea with bioregions is that they have porous boundaries, and the boundaries differ depending on the weight, complexity and availability of the product concerned. If we could impute the costs of energy impact to products, then we could fix tariffs between bioregions accordingly. And Tony, there's some work that New Economics Foundation did where they sort of laid out different products that would work over different distances, and that some things made sense to localize first, i.e. perhaps food, building materials. There's a guy called Jason McLennan who called it the near heavy far light economy. So things that are very heavy, you source closer to home. Do you think there is we could build some kind of a methodology around the things that it makes more sense to localize and the things that make more sense to import from farther away?
Yes, I do. A methodology would be great to create. I mean, I think that Molly mentions the costs of energy impact. It may be that systems such as tradable energy quotas and so on would in some way price in and correct, would get everything to the appropriate scale. I mean, I think that I would agree with Nigel, of course, that we're not into trying to correct the excesses of globalization by then swinging the pendulum too far the other way. I think it's more to pick up on what you said, Rob, about a series of sort of nested economies going from local to global. And there are there are some products that, like microchips and so on, that will probably need global scale for production. But as some are best produced on a continental, national, regional, I don't know enough about bioregions to speak to Molly's point, but it seems to be that there's a similar sort of idea going on there. But I think, the problem is at the moment is that lots of production that should more efficiently, if things were properly priced, be produced at more local scale, have gone to global scale, and that's really just reflecting the market power of corporations rather than a truly good economic outcome. But a question of what the methodology is to sort that out, well, I'd love to work on that.
And I think we're just seeing if Molly is trying to join us now. Molly, can you hear us?
I can hear you. You can't hear me.
Ah. Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
Welcome.
You can probably hear me through Skype then. I'm using my computer like a phone.
Okay. Well, welcome. You're very welcome. And have you been able to keep up with the last few minutes of the conversation?
Yeah. No, I can hear you perfectly. Yeah.
Okay. So
the typing that the European Parliament has already started this process of ensuring that the cost of products stay with the manufacturer, which then puts a market pressure for products to last longer, whereas at the moment the incentive is for products to have built-in obsolescence. And so once that becomes effective, it's already happening with cars and with electronic goods, we should see an economy where there's more incentive to repair things. So we'll have more high-skilled repair jobs in local economies rather than necessarily manufacturing jobs.
Molly, there's just a request. If you're sounding a bit muffled, if you could be a bit closer to your microphone.
I'm not entirely sure where my microphone is, but I'll do my best.
And I wondered maybe if you could just give us a sense of the work that you've done for your most recent book about bioregionalism. What do you think that bioregionalism brings to this discussion about economic blueprints, and what are your reflections having read through it?
Well, so the question I was trying to answer is how big is a local economy? So coming back to the sort of issues that Nigel was raising, and obviously the answer is it depends on what product we're thinking about. But that question took me into a lot of exploration about how we've come to think about provisioning as a society that has a very strong colonial history. And so we've lost contact with the production of our own local land. And that has left us, as Tony said, I agree with Tony, that's left us very vulnerable. And it's left us particularly vulnerable in this era of financial crisis. So really the bioregional proposal is provocative in the sense that it says to people, how would life be if you only had the resources of your region, defined as you said in terms of riversheds or mountains or something that makes sense geographically and biologically rather than political boundaries. What would life be like? What would be the advantages of that and the disadvantages of that? And obviously they're a bit numerous to mention here, but I think there's quite a strong cultural advantage. We often focus on the economic advantage and the jobs advantage, but actually I found that this is a way of getting people to identify more with their local place and using that as a substitute for the sort of consumer identities that people have now, which obviously are one of the things that's driving the unsustainable nature of our economy. I think we see that, you see that in Totnes, we see that in Stroud, where people actually enjoy the produce of the farmers market because they know it's local, as much as they like the taste and very good quality and so on.
I think the quality, Molly, is we're sort of struggling a bit with the quality there. We might have to lose the phone link, and maybe if you have any comments you want to put in on the side, we can read them out. Fiona, one of the questions that was raised about the Totnes blueprint was that that it was basically just about displacing it. As Tony said, if everywhere did it, would there actually be a net benefit to anybody? If Totnes is able to shift to 10% of consuming its own food rather than importing it, has the economic benefit of that, then that works while Totnes does it, but it doesn't work when everybody does it. What's your sense of that? If everybody did this, what would the kind of economic, how would there be a net benefit from
Yeah,
that?
I mean, my understanding is that if we just shifted it from one supermarket to another, for example, then that's not going to have any difference anywhere really in the system. But because we're talking about moving that food spend from, for example, a big supermarket like Morrison's into a much smaller scale food industry, then we know, going back to Tony's point earlier about efficiency, is that for the same amount spent in the supermarket as opposed to a small local independent food outlet, you actually create nearly 3 times as many jobs for the same amount of money spent. So in terms of producing more jobs, spending that money locally actually does produce more jobs, create more jobs and livelihoods. Yes, you might say that's less efficient in pure terms, but when we're looking for jobs and employment locally, then to me that seems like that's actually a net gain for us. And if we look at sectors like retrofitting and renewable energy, those are really new sectors for us everywhere at the moment. We don't have an enormous retrofit sector going on, we're trying to grow one. So those seem like new livelihoods and new jobs rather than displacement to me.
And Molly's just commented that the proportion of food that's grown locally and sold through local economic enterprises is tiny compared to the volume traded globally and sold in supermarkets. We don't have to worry about displacing economic value for a long time, in her opinion. Nigel, one of the things that's come out of the Totnes Blueprint has been this aspiration of saying if we could just shift 10% of what we spend locally to local produce, local traders, then there is a measurable economic benefit to the economy from doing that. What's your sense of how that might be achieved and the advantages and potential pitfalls of setting an aspiration such as that?
I think that the main problem with it is basically whose aspiration. We had this problem when we were doing development on a regional level, in the sense that we would do something in a particular area, and that might have benefits, really strong benefits for that particular area. But another part of the region would immediately say, yes, but we haven't got those benefits, and we don't take, you may even be displacing some activity. And again, the Cornwall-Devon was an example. Because of the European funding that was going into Cornwall, but was not available for Devon, then there was a direct incentive for businesses to set up on one side of the Tamar rather than another side of the Tamar. So I have to ask, how do you create the incentives for things to go local? What are the aspirational impacts of that if you're not part of that scheme? And this is where Tony's case is that everybody does it. Is it a zero-sum game? Do we end up with everybody trying to be local? Okay, we may have more jobs, but there may be less well-paid jobs. There may be less growth in the economy. And therefore, you end up with a net position across a wider area, whether that's a country or a county or whatever it is, that actually the net improvement that you're looking for in economic terms is not clear. Now, there may be other benefits. There may be benefits to the environment. There may be benefits to others. So we're probably saying that we'd like there to be less negative externalities in our market system. And I think on that basis, we can all agree. And if localism is directed at that, what is it about the current supply chain links or market links or transport systems that creates bads in terms of the Totnes area or Herefordshire or another area like that? And we should address those bads to make localism real. If you're just going to say you must do this local, as I said before, I think you will start to displace some activities which is not necessarily efficient to displace. So yes, I think we've got to think very carefully about what are the market failures here, what are the government failures here, what are the negative effects that they're having on your local economy, and if you did turn things local, how would you create the aspirations and the incentives for people to go along with it?
Last week I did an interview with Calvin Jones from the Cardiff Business School. And one of the things that he said in there, one of his reflections on the economic blueprint that was done for Totnes was the question for him was how would this work for a town in the South Wales valleys? for a town that has been hit hard by the closure of mining and has very little in the sense of kind of entrepreneurial stuff and social capital and so on. Tony, what's your sense of what the learnings might be from the process as it's been done in Totnes, Brixton and Hereford that could be applied to places suffering from more of those sorts of challenges? You've disappeared, you've gone quiet. And we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
That's better, yeah.
I was saying that Fiona may well have a better view of the lessons than me, but it's a very interesting point about how this process that's been led by very motivated and capable passionate people in all of these projects who've got a very clear understanding and a lot of knowledge about how things work. How that translates to areas which are on a real breadline, I guess, is quite tricky, particularly when, I'm going to give you a little example. I used to live in Padstow in Cornwall for a while, and bemoaning, as some people did, the loss of the 3 butchers, the greengrocer and the small local shops over a period of 5 or 6 years because a Tesco's opened on the edge of town. The sobering thought there is there's a little plaque in the Tesco's that thanks the people of Padstow for campaigning so hard on its behalf to have a store there. And so, a lot of local people on low incomes thought that Tesco's was an aspirational thing to have. It was going to save them money. It would prove that they had a modern town that had access to they want a McDonald's as well. That's they want all of those chains. So it's pretty hard. I mean, I think that they're not wrong to want those, but I think that springs from a lack of understanding about what's actually going to benefit the local economy and what's actually going to give them good jobs and what's actually going to lead to good local outcomes. But nevertheless, the perception is, because this has been a dominant discourse narrative politically, that the way to rescue areas in economic difficulty is for some giant corporations to come in and build something and employ people on the minimum wage. Overturning that narrative and that understanding is something that I guess we can only start to do if we have areas like Totnes and Herefordshire that try and model a genuine new way of relocalizing, which is smart and doesn't, have this blunt "we'll relocalize everything," idea, and that it actually shows positive benefits. If we can demonstrate those positive benefits, then hopefully that will help people to have a more nuanced view of the economics in this area. But that's a very long-winded way of saying I'm not sure that I'd be able to knock on the doors of people in the French valleys and necessarily convince them that relocalization is going to work for them. I think we've got to demonstrate that it works, and that's why these blueprints are so important.
So Molly's thoughts that she's put in response to that question, she says there are a lot of allotments and self-provisioning already there. Also, the point about mending rather than importing high-tech goods has particular relevance in an area of such high levels of unemployment and low-skilled employment. The South Wales Valleys has a growing season 6 weeks shorter than the Southwest, though, because it's high and cold. So at this point, I say if anybody is listening and would like to type in a question that we could discuss, that would be fantastic. And in the meantime, Fiona, I was going to ask you, what do you think so far, having seen this process being done in Hereford, being done in Brixton, and being done in Totnes? So you've got a rural market town, you've got an urban neighbourhood, and a county. What are emerging as the learnings on those 3 different scales and how this process is done differently in each place?
Yeah, I think the main things that have come out so far, for example, between Totnes at the town level and Herefordshire as a county, is something about that connection to a real sense of place in the work. So in Totnes, those of us who live here, we know our high street, we know our businesses, we feel this really kind of close connection to it. Whereas I think doing the work in Herefordshire, which is a big rural county, the people, it doesn't seem to have that same sense of connection and ownership of the work. Whereas in Brixton, which is a similar size to what we're doing, but much denser in terms of population, also seems to have that sense of community. This is our local economy, this is our community. So as we find with transition in general, there's definitely something about being closer to the place gives you more of a sense of passion for it and enthusiasm and connection to it. So yeah, there's some interesting learnings coming out about that, I think. And then the other really interesting thing between Brixton and Totnes is this fascinating thing about how much food can you produce in an urban setting. At the moment, there's practically no food produced in Brixton anyway, or in Lambeth for that matter. And yet they have an enormous number of people to feed, and so they're exploring some really interesting new approaches and some of the older approaches as well for urban food generation, which I think is going to really inform things for cities, which I'm really looking forward to seeing more about.
Thank you. And Nigel, I suppose one of the things that the blueprint does is tries to distinguish between the net benefit of different ways of doing things. So it would argue that a business, a locally owned, a locally based business which is supplying the local market has a greater net benefit in terms of the amount of money it encourages to cycle locally, the amount of economic activity that it creates, as opposed to the net benefit of a Tesco's or a Starbucks, which could be seen largely as an extractive industry. From your place of having worked more in regional economics, do you think there's any way in which economics can distinguish between those two things, and that development and the funding government approaches to development can actually distinguish between those two approaches?
I think the issue is basically information, in that the great problem is when you're trying to measure things which you haven't measured before. What's measured gets done, basically. And until you have the right information, you can't change behavior. I think a really good example of that was the recent fuss we had in the UK about horse meat in products on supermarket shelves. Now, that information was able to change people's attitudes and people's information. And certainly, just locally where I am, in Dorset, the local butchers, who are local businesses, they do employ more butchers than the supermarkets do, have done really well since that information came out. Now, they will only retain that if their quality is good and if their value is good. They are inherently more expensive than the supermarket meat shelves, but they are providing a great product, and people can see that once they've tried it, if you like. The real issue is, I think, this one about living standards, in the sense that that's great for middle class or upper class people to be able to, who can afford expensive joints of meat and who can afford the time to cook it and all the rest of it. There is still an issue about cost at a minimum level, especially in a downturn that's been going on for 5 years, where living standards are dropping in a way that we haven't seen in any of our lifetimes. So in this particular world we're in now, you really have to change people's attitudes and aspirations, and you can only do that by providing information. And the blueprint does that, but I think it's going to have to need more than that to produce some of the changes that we'd all like to see.
And Tony, from the perspective of New Economics Foundation, what would your sense be on that question of distinguishing between the net benefits of the more local economy and the more kind of corporate approach?
Well, I think that what Nigel says is of course true about this question of information. I think there comes a point where attempting to put the information back in so that people can act accordingly, as they did with the horse meat scandal, is either something that's going to be very difficult to do, or even unachievable, really, to get all the information about all the products, the supply chain of most processed food. I mean, you'd take 10 minutes to read it before you began to eat it. and there comes a point where actually the best solution is institutional. I mean, you should. It was a mistake to allow the local abattoirs to get closed down. I mean, we've allowed, even if that requires some regulation, taking a leaf out of the French book of protecting local bakers. It seems like a sort of meddling in the market thing to do, but actually ensuring good quality hand-baked bread on every high street by an institutional sort of intervention, i.e. protecting those bakers and having rules to make sure that they're there, is more effective than sort of a massive long label on a loaf telling you about where it's come from, all the stuff that might be in it, where all the ingredients came from. So I guess I think that there is something important around not waiting until we can measure all this stuff perfectly before we act, and I think that's perhaps a bit unpalatable for the sorts of sort of market economic theory we've had, which has been around trying to get the price right and then letting the market get on with it. I think sometimes we're just not going to be able to get the price right, and we have to make judgments about protecting local institutions, local shops against. I view it as leveling the playing field against the big global corporations, who I think are just able to exploit all of these hidden costs in order to offer what is apparently cheap food, but is not really cheap. I take the point about the affordability and is this just a middle class concern? But at the end of the day, the problem there is that the inequality of our economy now is such that that's a problem with wages. That's not a problem with the price of food. Wages are simply too low.
I was in Holland recently, and there they have a system where the recommended retail price is the price you can sell books at. So there is no Amazon operating there, and they still have a whole network of local independent bookshops because they aren't all being undercut. So Molly just wrote that she says, I have to disagree with Nigel there. My work in farmers markets made it clear that people on low incomes use them too. Somebody told me she was poor, that because she was poor, she had to buy good quality, hence her choice to buy local. Also, of course, retired people and people without work do have time to cook. It's knowledge and culture rather than time that means they buy ready meals. So, Fiona, I thought it might be interesting just to get a sense from you in terms of, particularly around the Totnes work, how the blueprint has identified this 10% sort of target of if 10% around food and other things can be shifted, the economic benefits of that. Is there any sense through the work going on there about how that 10% can be done in such a way that it's not just the people who can afford to? How could that shift towards the 10% bring as many people along with it as possible and not just be a kind of an exclusive thing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the truth is it's a bit of a myth that it's always more expensive to buy local and even buying organic, because if you're buying fresh, local, seasonal produce, then it competes really well with the supermarkets, and that's been shown time and time again. And the other thing that we're looking at is different distribution models. So how can we, for example, use food hubs? We're just doing a pilot in Bridgetown, which is one of our lower income areas here, about using a much simpler distribution system straight from the growers locally with low-cost, high-value, quality food boxes that they can come and pick up. And because the distribution system is much simpler, it's much lower cost and it's more direct to them. So one of our aims is to make sure that we are providing for people who are already struggling around here to be able to afford to buy food. And I think, if anything, that's got more of our focus, and to make sure that we don't increase the inequality in the system. That would be the last thing we want.
We have a question from Stephen McGeevy, who says, I know the Totnes Blueprint has been published recently, but how has the Totnes public reacted to this information? Has it been enough to motivate the community further?
Yeah, it's a good question, because we had some quite long and hard discussions about who this economic blueprint is for at this point in time. And actually the report that we've produced isn't really aimed at our local public, at the residents here. At this point in time, it's aimed at the organisations and businesses that we want to attract into our process and our strategic planning to work on that economic system. So to build the supply chain, for example. You know, there's no way at the moment, if Morrison shut down, we could produce enough local food for people. We need several years to build our capacity. So we decided quite intentionally that this document is aimed at the decision makers and the businesses that we want to get involved. But one of the priority projects that we've identified is starting to target certain sectors of our local community and to work with them to try and raise this awareness and shift some of these perceptions. So, for example, we know tourists, we have a lot of tourists here, and that's one particular segment we might work with. Another is the low-income homes, another is through the schools, for example. So that's something that we're going to be doing off the back of this work. But this work, its aim is not to engage the public with it per se. This is just the first step in a process that will include that later.
Thank you. And Nigel, your work was with the Southwest Regional Development Agency, which has now been replaced by the local enterprise partnerships, who still have that kind of regional brief of trying to promote economic growth in this area. And at the moment, they seem to be taking a perspective which is that growth is going to come from big regional strategic infrastructure projects and new distribution centres for supermarkets, new roads, that kind of thing. Can you see a way in which something like an economic blueprint could feed into the thinking of something like the local enterprise partnership, or are the two things just completely going off down different lines?
No, I think it would be very refreshing if we saw an LEP that was taking a different line. If you believe in why they were set up exactly to reflect local differences at a level below regions. And if there's any truth to that argument, politically and in policy terms, then it has to be about why is Devon or why is South Wales different? Why are they different from each other? What do they need? It should be different in different places. So I see absolutely no problem for LEPs looking at the blueprint and saying this is something we can endorse, because as Tony was saying, I wasn't saying we have to have everything measured before we can do anything. Part of the work that I used to be involved in was very much being a demonstration, saying, look what you can do. We've done this. This is the impact it's had. Therefore, other people can learn from that. And in that sense, I think the blueprint is ideal in the sense that as long as you can put things on the ground which demonstrate that a real impact locally, then you take people with you. And then afterwards you can start measuring it in traditional Office of National Statistics terms. So I think if you know there's a market failure or a government failure, and you know that if you did something it would have a demonstration effect, and it might be, sometimes it would not work. Sometimes you would say, oh, actually that was a waste of time. It was less efficient than what we had before. And sometimes it will work. But if you're careful and you focus on it, that's exactly the kind of thing that these local enterprise partners should be doing, especially in rural areas. I mean, it may be different in the big cities, but in a predominantly rural area like the southwest of England, that's exactly the kind of thing they could be doing. At the end, though, they have to show, because that's the way that the politics works, that they are creating jobs, that they are boosting productivity, and they are leading to higher living standards, because that is their fundamental goal. So if we can marry those two things together, I think it's all positive and we can all go along together. But the danger is that the extreme, because of the economic situation at the moment, the extreme focus on jobs at any cost, underlining at any cost, environmental cost and all other kinds of costs. That's the real issue for LEPs going forward. Can they see beyond that and really do some demonstration, because they haven't got the resources to do more than that, do some demonstrations of how things might be different and how it might work and how it might lead to jobs locally. And then we can all say yippee and be very pleased about the process.
So I'm just, it says there's some more questions in the thing, but I can't see any more questions. Okay. I've just seen there are some questions here that I hadn't seen before. Is the transition movement a way of stopping people from truly waking up to what needs to be done, which is to expose the monetary system? Tony?
Well, I'd say it's the I'd say it's the opposite actually. Quite a lot of what people in transition initiatives talk about is exactly the problems with the monetary system, which is why so many of them are keen on creating local currencies. In fact, even look at what local financial institutions they can either grow or set up, such as credit unions and CDFIs. So no, I would hope it's the opposite.
Okay. A sustainable economy is likely to be a smaller economy. How can we sell that idea in a present growth-obsessed climate? Nigel? Is a sustainable economy likely to be a smaller economy?
We may have to go through a transition in which the economy stays weak for a while, but in the long term, I don't see it that way. Because what we're saying is, in the future, we will value things that we didn't value in the past. We will value localism, and if people value localism, they'll get it. In the past, as the Padstow example we were given said, they wanted a supermarket, so they got a supermarket. It's the values of ordinary people underneath that matters. And if those values are changing and they're becoming greener or they're becoming more local, then absolutely fine. And we need to eventually to be able to measure that in some way and say things are better than they used to be. Growth 50 years ago didn't look like growth today. So the fact that GDP is going up is not the issue. It's what is GDP, what is it comprised of? And if it's comprised of the value that people put on being able to go around the corner to a baker's shop, as they do in France, then that's value, and that's real value, and that can be counted as part of GDP, and it can be counted as part of growth. I don't see this distinction between growth and sustainability. I think you can have both. And the real problem, obviously, is that we need growth as long as the population's growing.
Tony, would you like to come back on that? And also just Jay Tomp sent in a question. He said, how can this talk about comparative efficiencies make any sense as long as externalities of large industrial and financial corporates are not fully accounted for?
Yeah, well, on that second point first, I quite agree. I mean, I think I think economists and civil servants and politicians like to talk about market failure. So if there's a failure in the market, then it's justified that we intervene. I think the problem is that I don't think there's ever a market that isn't a failure. Really, to be perfectly honest with you, there's just degrees of failure. And when it comes to the power of global corporations, when it comes to the lack of transparency around production and the impacts that really has, I just think we have to take sort of proactive action. We have to take the view that we'll never reflect that. You can't capture that in a price. The market will never fix it. You have to take sort of institutional action, which we've discussed during this call. I mean, on the question of growth, I like Nigel's more nuanced description of growth. I think it's important to talk about growth of what? I mean, there is no doubt in my mind, and hopefully anybody rational outside Her Majesty's Treasury, that there can be no growth in material throughput and energy use on a global scale, and we've already exceeded actually what's sustainable, what the carrying capacity is. Now, so that implies a great reduction in material throughput and energy consumption in the rich nations, and a great increase in the poorer nations. Now, whether and that's just a reality. That's not a choice. That's what planet Earth is going to dish up for us. So we either respect that and find a way to live within it, or consequences may be unpleasant. Whether you can, to what extent you can eke greater production out of that reduced material throughput is highly questionable. I do think that you can get greater well-being, hopefully, out of a reduced material throughput. And I guess that's what Nigel was getting at when he said there's real value to people being able to connect locally with their shopkeepers and so on. Unfortunately, as one of the questioners said earlier on, our political narrative is so far away from any sensible discussion of this. I think and this is somebody who sort of his job is to try and enter into that debate at national level. I'm just really glad that people are trying to do it differently at local level, because I don't see much movement from Whitehall on this. No politician, even if they believe it, will dare stand up and question the primacy of GDP growth right now. And that makes it quite hard to have a sensible discussion about this stuff.
Thank you. Fiona, I wonder if I could just ask you if there are people who are listening to this and who are thinking, yeah, we'd really like to do this economic blueprint process for the place where we live. This sounds really exciting and could yield some really insightful stuff. Where do they start? Are we at a stage yet where you would parachute in and do a blueprint for them? Is there a how to do an economic blueprint guide somewhere? What's the next step if people want to do this?
Well, we're developing at the moment. We are seeing quite a bit of demand. People are quite interested in how can I run this process where I am. And so we're just developing an online or kind of virtual support system that will help places do that. So rather than having to, go to Totnes and go on a training, we're going to do something online that supports people as they go through the process. And those of us who've done it so far, we can share our learnings. And everywhere's going to do it a bit differently, but there's some common things that we can input and help people work through, and particularly the learning about the time and the budget and the approach and all the data sources, all that kind of thing. So we're actually at the point of just developing the first pilot course, and it's a great question because we're actively looking for people to come and participate on our first course as guinea pigs. And if you're interested, if you contact me, you can contact me through the Transition Network website. You can just search for Fiona Ward, you can contact me there. Because we're looking for places that want to do that, ideally transition towns or transition initiatives. But you do need to have some funding in place, ideally. I think it would be really, really difficult, if not impossible, to do this on a voluntary basis because it's significant work. But I'm happy to send the information out to anyone, so do get in touch as soon as possible. On that.
Thank you. So we've just got a couple of minutes left. I wonder if I could ask each of you just in 30 seconds just to give any closing thoughts you might have. Tony?
Thoughts. Well, I think this has been a really good discussion. I think we should have more discussions like this. I think that people who are engaging in this sort of rethinking of economic development at a local level are ahead of the level of thinking that probably you've got in most LEPs, and certainly in Whitehall. So I think, as Nigel called it, the demonstration effect, I hope, will be really positive. Just a quick point for the questioner on monetary reform. It is indeed really important to understand that banks create money and how the Bank of England works. But I wouldn't like to think that either NEF or the transition movement is hiding from that problem. It's not the only thing that we need to do.
Nigel?
I've been pleasantly surprised that we are on the same spectrum, even if we're not all on the same place in that spectrum. And I think that's a message for localism. As I said at the start, we don't want extreme globalization. We don't want extreme localism either. We've got to find where it works and where it doesn't work, and just be cleverer about those kind of things. And yeah, one would like to think LEPs can do it, but I don't know whether they've got the resources to do it.
Thank you. And Fiona?
I mean, it feels like it's a very exciting time, and I really see this is only the very, very beginning of this process, and we need to show that it can actually deliver jobs and it can deliver these livelihoods that we're talking about and these other benefits. So it feels quite exciting to have this opportunity to be in these places and doing this work. And there's a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainties, but it feels promising. So is it pioneering or pointless? I think I'd probably go with that pioneering, but I would say that as well.
So we must draw it to a close. So thank you to everybody who's attended. I'd like to thank our guests, Molly Scott-Cato intermittently, Fiona Ward, Tony Greenham and Nigel Jump. And I'd like to thank Simone Osborne and Desiree Cesarini for their work behind the scenes in helping to make this happen. I'd like to thank everybody who's been here and chipped in their questions and so on. The video of This webinar will be posted on YouTube over the next couple of days, so any debates you'd like to continue would be good to post as comments there. And thank you all very much for your time this afternoon. Goodbye.